October 12, 1943. 30,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. The sky was a brilliant blue canvas, marred only by scattered clouds and the distant smoke of naval engagements below. Lieutenant Commander Masao Seki of the Imperial Japanese Navy led his formation of 6 A6M Zeros with absolute confidence. They were the lords of the Pacific skies and had been for nearly 2 years. American pilots are predictable, Seki assured his wingmen that morning. They rely on their machines because their flying skills are inferior. Today will be no different. How terribly wrong he would be proven in the hours to come. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how Japan's elite naval aviators, considered untouchable in the early war years, would face a reckoning not just with a new American fighter, but with the harsh reality of industrial warfare that would transform their perception of the conflict forever. The morning briefing aboard the Japanese carrier Shokaku had been straightforward. Intelligence reports indicated American aircraft activity near Bougainville, likely supporting the recent landing operations. Commander Hiroshi Yamamoto, the air group leader, had studied the reports carefully. Recent engagements suggest the Americans are introducing a new fighter type, possibly a replacement for their Wildcats, Yamamoto informed his pilots. However, performance appears similar, perhaps marginally better, nothing that should concern our experienced pilots. Lieutenant Commander Seki nodded with approval. At 27 years old, with over 600 flight hours and 11 confirmed kills, he embodied the elite status of Japanese naval aviation. Like most of his peers, he had trained for nearly 3 years before seeing combat, mastering every aspect of his Zero fighter. Their production capabilities are impressive, admitted Lieutenant Toshio Abe, the intelligence officer, but quality still defeats quantity. 1 Zero can handle 3 American fighters, as we've proven repeatedly. The statistics supported their confidence. The Zero could outmaneuver any Allied fighter, with a climb rate of 300 feet per minute and a turning radius that had shocked Western observers. American pilots had learned to avoid dogfighting at all costs when encountering Zeros. Across the Pacific, aboard the USS Essex, a very different briefing was taking place. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, already a celebrated ace, addressed his squadron of F6F Hellcat pilots. The carrier's ready room was packed with young aviators, many on their first combat deployment. "Gentlemen, you're flying the most powerful naval fighter in this war, though the Japanese don't know it yet," O'Hare explained, pointing to the performance charts. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine delivers 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what their Zeros can produce. Ensign Robert Jensen, fresh from flight school, raised his hand. "Sir, if we have such an advantage, why have we been told to avoid turning fights?" O'Hare smiled. "Because smart fighters play to their strengths. The Zero still turns tighter at low speeds, but with our power, we can control when and how we engage. We dictate the terms of battle now." The statistics told the story. The F6F Hellcat could climb at 3,500 feet per minute, reached a top speed of 300 m/m, nearly 50 meters faster than the Zero, and carried 6 50 caliber machine guns against the Zero's 2 20mm cannons and 2 7mm machine guns. Most importantly, the Hellcat featured armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, allowing it to absorb damage that would send a Zero down in flames. Lieutenant James Harrison studied the tactical manual. "So we use high-speed passes and vertical maneuvers, where our power advantage is greatest?" "Exactly," O'Hare confirmed. "The Japanese pilots are exceptional, probably the best trained in the world. But they're fighting with yesterday's technology against tomorrow's, and in industrial war, that gap only widens. As both fighter groups launched from their carriers that October morning, neither fully appreciated how this day would exemplify the shifting balance of power in the Pacific Air War. Lieutenant Commander Seki led his 6 Zeros climbing eastward toward Bougainville. The morning sun glinted off the canopies of their elegant fighters. Each pilot had personally customized his aircraft's control response, a privilege that highlighted the artisanal approach to Japanese military aviation. "Formation tighten up," Seki ordered through the radio. "Remember to maintain visual contact in the sun quadrant. The Americans like to use the sun." His wingman, Lieutenant Kenji Okada, acknowledged with a wing waggle. At 25, Okada represented the slightly younger generation of pilots who had begun training after the war started. Though still highly skilled, he had received 18 months of training rather than the 3 years Seki had enjoyed. "Clear skies and calm winds," Okada noted. "Perfect hunting weather." As they approached 27 feet, the temperature outside dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Inside their cockpits, the Japanese pilots had minimal heating, a discomfort they'd learned to endure. Their aircraft lacked insulation, pressurization, and even proper defrosting systems for the canopies. Sacrifices made for weight reduction and maneuverability. Aboard the USS Essex, Hellcat Squadron VF-9 was completing its own launch sequence. Lieutenant Commander John Smith led the formation of 8 fighters, each weighing 190 pounds fully loaded, nearly 40% heavier than the 7 650-pound Zero. The difference was not just in weaponry, but in protection. Each Hellcat carried 212 pounds of armor plating and featured self-sealing fuel tanks that added considerable weight. Alley Cat formation. "Radio check," Smith called to his pilots. The responses came back clear and professional. "Alley Cat 3, loud and clear. Alley Cat 4, reading you 5 by 5. Ensign Thomas Wilson, flying his 3rd combat mission, adjusted his heated flight suit. The Hellcat's cockpit was warm and relatively comfortable, with defrosting systems keeping the canopy clear even at high altitudes. These seemingly minor details reflected fundamentally different design philosophies. The Zero sacrificed everything for performance, while the Hellcat balanced performance with pilot protection and survivability. At 9:10 hours, the radar operator aboard the Essex reported contacts. "Bandits bearing 270, range 30 miles, altitude Angels 27. The information was relayed to the airborne fighters through their robust radio equipment, another area where American technology excelled. Lieutenant Commander Smith immediately directed his squadron. "Alley Cats, form up on me. We'll climb to 30-00 and use our altitude advantage. Remember your training, energy tactics, not turning contests." While the Americans had radar guidance, Seki's formation relied on visual acquisition. The Imperial Japanese Navy had operational radar systems, but they were not integrated into fighter direction to the same degree as their American counterparts. This meant that the first indication of enemy presence often came when pilots spotted them visually, sometimes too late for optimal positioning. At 0917 hours, Lieutenant Okada spotted the American formation. "Contact high, 2 o'clock, 8 aircraft, new type." Seki assessed the situation. The American fighters were slightly above them and coming from the direction of the sun, a solid tactical approach. But he remained confident. They appeared to be the new fighter type intelligence mentioned. "Remember, they may be faster in a dive, but they cannot match our climbing or turning ability. Break into pairs and engage when they commit." The Japanese pilots fanned out into their practiced pairs, preparing for the Americans to dive on them, after which they would use their superior turning ability to get behind the heavier US fighters. It was a tactic that had worked countless times against Wildcats and P-39s. Aboard his Hellcat, Lieutenant Commander Smith observed the Japanese formation dispersing. "They're setting up for a turning fight. Stick to the plan. High-speed slashing attacks. Use your power on the climb back up. Don't get suckered into a low-speed fight." The American formation split into 4 pairs, maintaining their altitude advantage. Smith and his wingman, Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez, took the first pass. "Commencing attack," Smith announced, pushing his throttle forward. The R-2800 engine responded with a surge of power that pressed him back in his seat. The Hellcat accelerated rapidly, building energy for the coming engagement. Below, Seki watched the first pair of American fighters diving toward them. He waited until they committed to their attack run before giving the order. "Now! Brake and turn into them." Seki pulled his Zero into a tight turn, expecting to swing around behind the Americans as they zoomed past. The Zero responded beautifully, whipping around in a tight circle that would have been impossible for any previous American fighter to match. What happened next shattered Seki's tactical assumptions. Instead of continuing past in a vulnerable position, the lead Hellcat pulled up in a power climb that seemed to defy physics. Despite being in the middle of a high-speed attack, the American fighter transitioned to a climb that matched what Seki's Zero could achieve at its best. "They can climb!" he shouted in surprise, watching as the Hellcat maintained energy through a maneuver that should have left it vulnerable. Lieutenant Rodriguez, flying as Smith's wingman, had a perfect firing position on one of the turning Zeros. He pressed the trigger, sending 6 streams of 50 caliber rounds into the Japanese fighter. The Zero's unprotected fuel tanks erupted in flames, and the aircraft disintegrated. "Scratch 1-0, Rodriguez reported calmly. Seki watched in horror as Petty Officer Yamada's Zero fell away in pieces. The American fighters weren't just making high-speed passes. They were maintaining enough energy to stay in the fight, something the Wildcats had never been able to do. "Be careful. They have more power than expected," Seki warned his remaining pilots. Lieutenant Okada found himself under attack from another Hellcat pair. He executed a textbook defensive turn, expecting to outturn his attacker. But the Hellcat, piloted by Lieutenant Harrison, didn't try to match the turn. Instead, it pulled up into a vertical climb, rolled over the top, and came back down in a position to fire again. "Their climbing performance is exceptional," Okada radioed, a note of concern evident in his voice. "They're using vertical maneuvers to negate our turning advantage." The next few minutes transformed the Japanese pilots' understanding of their situation. The American fighters were demonstrating performance capabilities that intelligence had completely underestimated. They were faster, climbed nearly as well, and while they couldn't turn with the Zeros, they didn't need to. Ensign Wilson, in his Hellcat, found himself behind a Zero that was trying desperately to turn inside his flight path. Rather than trying to follow, Wilson pulled straight up, using his Hellcat's tremendous power to gain altitude rapidly. "Look at that climb rate," his wingman, Ensign Davis, commented. "These Japanese boys are in for a shock today." The Zero pilot, Petty Officer Takahashi, looked up in astonishment as the supposedly inferior American fighter rocketed skyward. Everything he'd been taught about American aircraft limitations was being disproven before his eyes. Seki attempted to regain tactical control of the deteriorating situation. "Group, climb to Angels 32. We need altitude." But as the Zeros began their climb, the Hellcats matched and exceeded their rate of ascent. The fundamental performance advantage that Japanese pilots had relied upon was gone. Ensign Wilson lined up another Zero in his sights. His 6 50 caliber machine guns chattered, sending 100 rounds per second toward the enemy fighter. Several rounds struck the Zero's engine, while others tore through the unprotected cockpit. The Japanese aircraft immediately burst into flames and began spiraling toward the ocean 30,000 feet below. "They have tremendous firepower," Lieutenant Okada reported, witnessing his comrade's demise. "And they're heavily armored." This observation came as Okada fired a burst from his 20mm cannons into a Hellcat's wing. Where such hits would have destroyed any aircraft they'd previously encountered, the Hellcat shrugged off the damage and returned fire. Okada pushed his Zero into a desperate dive, the only maneuver that might save him from the American superior firepower. The engagement lasted less than 8 minutes, but it fundamentally altered the participants' understanding of the air war. 4 of the 6 Zeros were shot down, with a 5th badly damaged. Only Seki and the wounded Okada managed to escape, using their Zero's superior range to outdistance the American pursuit. Lieutenant Commander Smith assembled his Hellcats after the engagement. They had lost 1 aircraft to battle damage, though the pilot had parachuted safely and would be rescued by a PBY Catalina flying boat. The remaining 7 Hellcats, despite taking hits, were all operational, a testament to the aircraft's durability. "Good discipline, everyone," Smith commended his pilots. "That's how we fight these engagements from now on. Speed, power, and vertical maneuvers." Aboard the Hellcats, the American pilots were processing what they'd experienced. Ensign Wilson couldn't believe how easily their new fighters had handled the previously feared Zeros. "It's like bringing a modern car to a horse race," he remarked to Davis as they flew back toward the Essex. "Those Zeros are magnificent machines, but they're outdated now." Lieutenant Commander Seki and Lieutenant Okada made a difficult return flight to the Shokaku. Okada's Zero had taken damage to its oil system, and he was forced to make a water landing near the carrier. Though he was rescued, his Zero, one of Japan's increasingly irreplaceable fighters, sank beneath the waves. In his after-action report, Seki struggled to convey the paradigm shift he had witnessed. The new American fighter possesses performance characteristics far exceeding intelligence estimates. Most significantly, its power-to-weight ratio allows climbing and acceleration performance approaching that of the Zero, while maintaining superior speed and dive capabilities. Commander Yamamoto reviewed the report with growing concern. "What is your tactical assessment, Seki-san?" Seki chose his words carefully. "The performance gap we relied upon has closed. We can no longer expect to dominate through superior aircraft performance. The Americans have not just matched us, they have surpassed us." The implications extended far beyond a single engagement. Lieutenant Toshio Abe, the intelligence officer, consulted production figures during the debriefing. "American factories produced 305 F6F Hellcats last month alone," he informed the somber gathering. "Our combined production of all fighter types was 167 in the same period." The statistics painted a grim picture. The United States was not only deploying technologically superior aircraft, but producing them at nearly double Japan's rate. By the end of 1943, monthly Hellcat production would reach 500 units, while Zero production struggled to maintain 150 per month. Aboard the USS Essex, a different kind of debriefing was taking place. Lieutenant Commander O'Hare assessed the combat reports with satisfaction. "Gentlemen, today confirmed what we expected. The F6F Hellcat has changed the equation in the Pacific. The Zero is still a capable aircraft, but it belongs to yesterday's war." The performance statistics were reviewed in detail. The Hellcat's 200 horsepower engine produced 60% more power than the Zero's 130 horsepower Sakai engine. This power difference explained the American fighter's ability to maintain energy through maneuvers that would have left earlier fighters vulnerable. "The Japanese pilot training program remains excellent," O'Hare acknowledged, "but they can't overcome this performance gap through skill alone. And with our production rates, we're replacing pilots faster than we're losing them." They aren't. This last point highlighted another critical aspect of the Pacific Air War. While American pilots operated on a rotation system, serving combat tours before returning to train new pilots, Japanese aviators generally fought, until they were killed. Their expertise died with them, creating an experience vacuum that grew worse as the war progressed. Following the October engagement, Lieutenant Commander Seki found himself reassigned to a training role in Japan. His combat experience was now considered too valuable to risk on frontline operations, a telling shift in Japanese military thinking. At the Yokosuka training base, Seki met with a class of new pilot candidates. Their training program had been shortened to 9 months, a third of what he had received before the war. "You will be facing a new American fighter called the Hellcat," he informed them. "It possesses exceptional power and climbing abilities. The tactics you have been taught must be adjusted." A young pilot candidate raised his hand. "Sir, we were told that American pilots rely on their technology because they lack skill. Is this accurate?" Seki paused, remembering his own confidence before that fateful encounter. "Their technology is formidable. Do not underestimate either their machines or their improving skills. The war has changed." The Japanese naval air arm was facing a crisis beyond just the introduction of the Hellcat. Their irreplaceable veteran pilots were being lost at an unsustainable rate. The intensive pre-war training program that had produced pilots like Seki could not be replicated under wartime conditions. By early 1944, the statistical reality had become overwhelming. The United States had delivered 2 545 F6F Hellcats to frontline units in just over 6 months. Japan's total fighter production for the same period was approximately 100 aircraft across all types. Lieutenant Okada, recovered from his injuries, found himself leading inexperienced pilots with barely adequate training. During a February 1944 mission near Truk, he witnessed the consequences of this training gap. "Maintain formation discipline," he instructed his 4 rookie pilots as they patrolled at 20,000 feet. "Remember, if we encounter Hellcats, avoid turning engagements. Use our range advantage to disengage if necessary." Within minutes, radar-directed Hellcats from USS Intrepid found them. The American formation, led by Lieutenant Harrison, now a seasoned Hellcat pilot, executed a perfect high-side approach. "Alley Cats, engage as planned. Hit and climb, don't stick around," Harrison directed. Despite Okada's warnings, 2 of his inexperienced pilots attempted to dogfight with the Hellcats. Within seconds, both were shot down by the Americans' superior firepower and energy-fighting tactics. "Break away, full emergency power," Okada ordered his remaining pilots, pushing his Zero into a steep dive to escape. Only 1 of his remaining pilots successfully disengaged. The 4th, Ensign Tanaka, with barely 120 flight hours total, became fixated on an American fighter and attempted to pursue it, only to be caught by another Hellcat diving from above. After returning to the carrier Zuikaku, Okada filed a sobering report. "Our pilot quality has deteriorated to critical levels. Combined with the superior performance of enemy fighters, we can no longer achieve favorable exchange ratios under any circumstances." The statistics supported his assessment. In engagements between Hellcats and Zeros during early 1944, the kill ratio favored the Americans by nearly 10:1. A single Hellcat squadron might lose 1 pilot while shooting down 10 Japanese aircraft. Meanwhile, American production continued to accelerate. Ensign Wilson, now promoted to lieutenant junior grade, was surprised to learn that damaged Hellcats were often simply pushed overboard to make room for brand new replacements. "We're discarding fighters for minor battle damage that the Japanese would spend weeks repairing," he remarked to Lieutenant Rodriguez during a maintenance tour. "It's not just that our fighters are better, we have so many that they're almost disposable." Rodriguez nodded. "The factory in Bethpage is producing a complete Hellcat every hour around the clock. They've built over 3,000 already, and they're just getting started. By comparison, Japan's total production of A6M0s from 1939 to 1945 would reach only 10 939 aircraft. Grumman would produce 12 275 Hellcats in just 3 years, from 1943 to 1945. In April 1944, Lieutenant Commander Seki was reluctantly returned to combat operations due to critical pilot shortages. Before departing Yokosuka, he met with naval engineering officers who were developing the next generation of Japanese fighters. The A6M0 was the perfect fighter for 1940, explained Commander Jiro Horikoshi, one of the Zero's designers. But warfare advances rapidly. The Americans studied our weaknesses and built the Hellcat specifically to exploit them. Can we not do the same? Seki asked. Horikoshi shook his head. Our industrial capacity is the limiting factor, not design expertise. We have excellent designs on paper, but limited ability to produce them in quantity. The Americans have both. This reality was demonstrated in the statistics. By mid-1944, American factories were producing aircraft aluminum at a rate of 148,000 tons per month, more than Japan's total production for the entire war. A single American engine factory could produce more aircraft engines in a month than all of Japan's factories combined. On June 19, 1944, during what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the consequences of this industrial disparity became devastatingly clear. Japanese naval aviation suffered losses from which it would never recover, with over 300 aircraft destroyed in a single day. Lieutenant Commander Seki led one of the few partially successful Japanese fighter groups during the battle. His experience allowed him to keep his division of 4 Zeros intact long enough to protect a small portion of the Japanese bomber force. But watching the slaughter of less experienced pilots, he recognized that individual skill could no longer compensate for the overwhelming American advantage. We are not just fighting their machines, he told Lieutenant Okada after they landed on Zuikaku's deck. We are fighting their factories, and that is a battle we cannot win. The statistical reality had become impossible to ignore. By the end of 1944, F6F Hellcats had achieved a 19-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. Of the 477 Japanese aircraft destroyed by Navy fighters during the war, 75% would fall to Hellcats. When the war ended in August 1945, only a handful of Japan's elite pre-war naval aviators remained alive. Lieutenant Commander Seki was not among them, having been killed during the Battle of Leyte Gulf while attempting to protect a Japanese carrier force from waves of Hellcats. Lieutenant Okada survived, one of the few experienced Japanese pilots to witness the entire tragic arc of their naval air force. In a 1962 interview with American historians, he reflected on the psychological impact of encountering the Hellcat. The Zero represented our approach to warfare, precise, skillful, elegant, he explained. The Hellcat embodied the American way, powerful, practical, abundant. When we first encountered their new fighter, we did not just face a superior machine. We faced an industrial reality that made our defeat inevitable. The moment I saw that Hellcat climb with such power, he continued, I understood something fundamental had changed in the war. Our training could not overcome their technology, and our factories could not match their production. The Hellcat with its 200 horsepower engine was not just a better fighter, it was a symbol of why we could not win. In the end, the confrontation between the Zero and the Hellcat represented more than just a technological mismatch. It exemplified the fundamental nature of modern industrial warfare, where production capacity ultimately proves more decisive than individual skill or elegant design. The F6F Hellcat would finish the war with a 19-1 kill ratio, the best of any fighter aircraft in history. Yet this remarkable achievement came not just from its technical superiority, but from the industrial might that could replace every lost Hellcat and pilot. While Japan's irreplaceable aviators and their increasingly obsolete fighters diminished with each engagement, for pilots like Seki and Okada, the shock of discovering the Hellcats' true capabilities came too late to change their nation's strategy. The 200 horsepower engine that powered their enemies' fighters represented not just a technical specification, but the unbridgeable gap between Japan's limited resources and America's overwhelming industrial capacity, a gap that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Pacific War. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.